Hello, this is Will Faerber from Art to Ride, and today we're looking at the first submission by Emmeli of her horse Nacho. Nacho is a 7-year-old. She's had him since he was 4, and he really hasn't done much. She's showing some pictures here of when he just began working. And this is how she rode before she began to work in the classical foundation method. And while you can see he's actually a pretty good mover, but just running with his head up in the air, so not engaging over his back and just quick, short, choppy steps. Obviously very inverted, not in sync between the front end and the back end. If you look closely, you'll see the front legs moving before the back leg, which is what happens when horses are not over their backs. And once again, that's the biggest thing that we talk about when we see horses over their backs, that they can become rhythmic. When we talk about rhythm, we're talking about the two ends of the horse being in rhythm. And that's really what the word cadence means. When your horse's rhythm gets so good that it's totally synced between the front and the back end, then you could say the horse is cadenced. So this looks much better here, getting back to where we are now. She's already got the horse stretching really nicely here, doing really good work in hand, as we saw with her last horse. Emmeli's done a really good job with both of these horses. Remember, I only saw these people just back at the end of the summer, so she's come a long way since I saw these horses, which couldn't do any of this when I first saw her. So she's come a long, long way. And I see you're all bundled up there. We here in California here are so spoiled. But I love this because I think, places like where you guys ride there in the wintertime, you have to really want to do this, to get out there and do this in the cold. And we see some of the tapes of people in the snow and this sort of thing. So that's kind of how I grew up. I never had an indoor arena. We worked our horses out in the snow when it snowed. So you've really done a great job here. This is just a perfect stretch in the walk. Couldn't ask it to be any better than it is right here. I mean, if anything, maybe a little longer step, but right there is pretty much optimal for this horse right there. Now we can see, if we take a look at this horse's hind legs, this is one of those horses that appears to be almost straight. It has almost no flexion in its hock. But notice how as it does stretch its head down, how much more flexion is in the hock, very naturally, and that's what we're looking for. Really good work here, just nice and active. Kind of slows down a little bit at the corners, but I wouldn't expect more than that. Now, if you see where your whip is there, that's one thing you got to work to always keep that whip down along the side of the horse where you're going to use it. And always remember, when we work in hand, we want to try to use the whip exactly where we use our leg on the side of the horse, so the horse will relate the two together. And a lot of horses, especially mares, if you touch them with the whip too far back on their flanks or hip bones, they'll kick out and things like that. So have to be careful of that. But once again, that's why it's so important to get that whip down. So other than that, everything here is going really good. Just don't want to see your whip up like a antenna kind of sticking above the horse. So working out that problem of how to hold the whip in your hands. As I say, I always do it with my palms up, and then I hold the whip in such a way that it's almost like holding chopsticks, so I can keep it exactly where I want it in the rein at the same time. So you hear it's still sticking up. You see what I'm talking about? So that whip needs to just come down. Other than that, you're doing a great job here. But we want the whip just like your leg. We want our leg to hang loose and around the horse so that when we need to use it, it's literally lying right against the horse at all times, but without any tension. And same thing here through the whip. If it's not down where it belongs, and if something goes wrong here, you'd have a hard time getting the whip back to where it needs to be to ask him to step over again. So just think about that as you go on. But the rest of this is really quite good. I mean, it could be a little more active there, but I think you're aware of that. Obviously, you improve it every time it does get too slow. Now here he's stretching, but like there you go. It gets a little deeper, and then it starts, once you get on the straight line there, it starts to look a little better, and he starts to swing a little more actively. There, and we get a much bigger reach out of the step. And so yeah, we start to get some flexion in the hocks. And that's what we're looking for. And this is the only way you can, there's lots of methods, as we all know, out there of training horses that are supposed to get them doing one thing or another. But The point being is, this is the only way you'll get a horse like this, who's built like this, to get the best and optimal movement out of him. It's the best, it's the only way to do it on every horse. But it's really apparent, you know, when people have these $1 million movers that are so fabulous, and they have so much natural flexion in their hocks. Once again, that's why people are getting by, because the judges are either corrupt themselves, or they simply don't have enough knowledge themselves to be able to judge what they're looking at, which certainly seems like a lot of them. Though today the problem is most of them are just afraid that they'll never get hired again, because everybody who's in this show world of horses knows that way we're at today, if a judge gives any of the top riders any kind of bad score, they will never judge again. And that's really what it comes down to, and they know it. So none of them have the courage to say what they should be saying, even the ones that know. A really great walk here. You've done such a good job with this. And show me that you have a really good feel for this compared to what I saw, you know, for someone just starting out. We got a long way at the last clinic when I saw her, but nothing like we're seeing here. You've really brought this to work. And as I said, once you understand this is the hardest thing to get in all of training. Just having the patience to wait for this to happen, and then once you can get this happening, having the patience to wait for the horse to develop underneath you. So those are the two most, in fact, I would say simply, the most important, you know, attribute that a trainer can have is patience. A horse trainer with no patience is never going to get very far with most horses. Not in a good way. Not that they're going to end up being a happy horse in the end. Anyway. So that was all really good walk work. Once again, same thing on this side. Just could be a little more active. But other than that, it's really good. Now, I would like to see you beginning to do a little more lateral work with the horse, coming down your center lines and doing more leg yields a little bit more. But the most important thing you're achieving, which is just get the horse to stretch. But you see here with the whip, same thing. You've got the whip sticking straight up in the air, so it's sticking above the horse's back, kind of like an antenna. And it's not where it needs to be if you needed to ask the horse. For instance, if I asked you right now to turn on the center line, do a leg yield, you'd have to rearrange your hand there. So working out a better position of your hand there with the whip, so that you can keep the whip alongside the horse. As I said, we want to be able to tap the horse right about where your leg would go. Now that means also if you're working with a much smaller horse, then you'd want a little bit smaller horse, a whip that is. So the right size for the right horse, so that you end up being able to touch the horse where you need it. Once again, that's right alongside, right where your boot would be, or right behind where your boot would be on the side of the horse. Doing a little bit shoulder in there, and that was a good example right there, how he started to get a little resistive, and you brought your rein upwards a little bit on the inside, and then the horse wanted to go right back down in the stretch. So that was really good, and exactly the effect that we're looking for. So the horse seeks downward the contact to escape any kind of, you know, even a little harsher. So you see how easily horses react to that. You realize, and just like with your whip, you know, horses become, even a very dull horse, or a warm blood, so to speak, or even a cold-blooded horse, like some of these are a little bit that way. You know, imagine what you'd get. They already don't want to move. So if you were holding against their mouths, they would never go anywhere. But that was a perfect example of how just that little bit more contact, the horse didn't even want that, and it was stretched right back down to where the contact became just the weight of the rein again, and that's what we want to teach the horse to seek. Just like that. Now that's really a good walk. And once again, looking at this horse's back legs, you can see when it really gets down there how those hocks actually flex a little bit. There, now that's really good. All the way down there is optimal. Once again, look at the back end and see whether the hocks are flexing, to what degree they are. This is a horse with quite straight hind legs. But that doesn't mean it can't get over its back, and when you get it over its back working correctly, this horse will go from being a 2-mover to being a 7. So unfortunately, that became the criteria with horses today in dressage, is just breeding one very much like saddlebreds or Tennessee Walkers, who are already kind of born in this phony position where the necks come way up out of the shoulders straight up, and you know, just like a saddlebred is built. That's what they've started building dressage horses the same way, and of course very, very calm, so they accept the kind of harsh work that they're given. But imagine how beautiful those horses would be, and how much longer they would last. You know, and that should always be, it certainly is mine. When I look at trainers, what I look at is whether they can keep horses going or not, or how long they keep them. Best riders in the world are the ones who keep their horses going the longest. And I mean without drugs and without drugging, without joint injections and all this kind of nonsense. But even with all the joint injections, I'm amazed how people, they say they're supposed to help the horse, yet all these 7 and 8-year-olds are being put down these days because their joints are ruined. So people really need to think about that before you ever let some trainer or veterinarian talk you into injecting your horse's joints. If you work your horses correctly, they will generate, in the right length of time, the right amount of joint fluid that they need. But if you're working them for hours and hours harshly and stiff and tense, well, you're going to destroy the joints one way or another. And why these joint injections might help you for a little while longer, it's obvious by looking at what short careers most horses have today that this isn't really the answer. Really good there. Notice when he just drops that last bit, all of a sudden that walk really just takes off. So that's exactly what we're looking for, and exactly what we would be looking for before we want to get on the horse and ride much. So that would be our goal, is to get to that point just like you have there, where it's all the way down. When we get on, we should be able to recreate that same thing. So once we understand these steps, it just takes all the guesswork out. It's a very nice letter that Emmeli wrote to us today, talking how she feels like she knows what she's doing now. And that's exactly what I want all of you to do. Once you realize this simple system that just puts one step in front of the next one, we're always moving forward. There is no faster way to train horses than this, folks, and actually have a good result. This is the way the great masters came up with in order to get a good result. So remember always that I didn't invent any of this. I just was fortunate enough to learn it as a young man and then to relearn it as an adult after, just like all of you, trying to learn from trainers who didn't know what they were doing. I walked away from all of them going, this isn't it. Because I'd ridden like this when I was a child, so I was never going to accept the idea of pulling a horse's head in and hanging onto it for dear life. It just never felt right. But I think it never does feel right to people who are sensitive to animals. So great job there. On the work in hand, really, really good. Right to where I'd like to see the horse doing, and getting on. This is pretty much what I want to see the horse to do. Should be able to get on. Now, you can see that walk is it's not quite as swingy as when it was free, and that really has to be our goal. But that's looking very good there. Once again, notice how the lower the horse drops its head and neck, the more it swings through behind. Watch as it brings the head and neck up, how it just shortens. So that's the biggest thing to take away too, is this idea that we're never shortening the horse. That's not balance. When you see people, I see they usually use terms like collect them up and things like this, which is pretty meaningless. And they're usually talking about horses that have no ability to collect. So what they're really talking about, what they mean, is put them together or package them. We've all heard these kind of silly terms that trainers use. A really good walk in the stretch there. Once again, every time it goes down there, look how much better the horse looks, even just as looking at it as a piece of horse flesh. And as to the thing of whether they're on the forehand or not, of course a horse at this level is somewhat on the forehand, but it's more on the forehand, it's less on the forehand than it would be if we pulled the head and neck up in the air. This is the only way to get the horse really off the forehand and not just shortened. And that was one of the big things that, when the influences of the ring riders, so to speak, in classical dressage, that sort of Baroque idea of classical dressage where they never rode their horses outside and this sort of stuff, and it became like this indoor sport. You could get away with doing the kind of hollow-backed, very similar to what we see, and that's part of the confusion, that people don't realize that dressage evolved. Yes, it was called dressage, but in the 1600s or whatever, but it evolved into something much better when the cross-country riders were the great cross-country riders and things, which were mostly from England and Italy and places like that where they did a lot of jumping, and France, and they begin to do more with these horses and ask more of them, staying over their backs. We found that if you take a horse, and that should be the ultimate goal. Even the Spanish riding school talks about that. I mean, they jump their young horses. So if a horse is not working over its back, it's going to jump terribly. So that's the point at which dressage, we begin to look at more of what we're talking about here and getting horses over their backs in real dressage. And that's when it began to happen in reality also. Remember that, even jumping as we know it today, the forward seat only started in the late 1800s. So, this is all relatively new. In fact, Caprilli himself, who invented that forward seat where you pinch with your knee, actually died falling off on his head. So, just because something was something 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago doesn't mean it still is now. That is, the sport evolved into what it now should be, which is a combination. In modern dressage, the idea was to combine the open extended gaits with the just collected trot gaits and things like this, to get an all-around horse that could still jump and go cross-country, not just something that would go around a little 15 by 30 meter arena, which is the size that they used to use for classical dressage back in the day, so to speak, or the dressage of the day, So confusing for people to realize that that was an evolutionary step in what was happening out there in terms of, the original, what we might have called various schools of dressage. So there was a school which people think of, and I think Philip Carl and people like this sort of fall into this, of this older sort of Baroque hollow back dressage, where you're just trotting around a ring, and yes, it looks fancy to those who don't know what they're doing about it, but they're not usually connected from front to back, and that being the real criteria with whether or not you're really doing dressage or not, or that is the most evolved form of dressage. So that's one way we must think about it. And then after World War II, the few great lights that we had, Nuno Oliveira and Egon von Neindorf, who were champions of this style, stopped training because even back then, right after World War II in the 50s, they recognized how bad dressage was coming and both walked away from it. Just as Michael Matz in our own country here, I remember him talking about, well, why did you leave jumping? He was probably one of the top 2 or 3 jumping riders we ever produced here, and he went on to training racehorses, which obviously he did very well with. But his quote was simply, "I didn't like the direction the sport was going." Well, it's too bad that all these great lights, just disappeared out of the sport rather than, trying to buck the system, which is what the rest of us now have to do because, all of our judging has become skewed. So all the classes have become skewed into strange things that don't even look like riding anymore. If you see some of the clips of these Western riders and things like this, what that's turned into these days. So your walk work was all really quite good here with this horse. Starting to stretch a little bit there, so that's coming really nicely. So everything I've seen here has been really a huge improvement. Like just what you're doing there, just widening your hands. Once again, remember that when someone asks you, that's just a technique that we use to teach the horse contact so that we don't lose contact with the mouth of the horse as we teach it to stretch into that contact. And it isn't long after that that we can keep our hands, as you even have them there, back in the right position where we want them ultimately when we speak about an equitation position. But always remember that our position, while it does affect the horse, it's not the total influence on the horse. That it must be, I'd rather have you look a little sloppy in the saddle than to look like you're holding yourself perfectly and the horse isn't going anywhere. So stillness in the saddle comes with time, and as the horse gets over its back, it enables us to become more still and forces you, as I see you doing here, as this horse gets round, you're really having to stretch up and get your body into the right position, which is part of that thing of getting used to of a horse stretching down, especially some of the ones who are just beginning it, because they stretch down, the horse has no top line, will stretch its neck straight down to the ground, and all of a sudden you have nothing in front of you. And of course people like the idea of having that handlebar up there to grab a hold of. Well, when they're down the stretch. Now that's beautiful right there, and that's about optimal for this horse. And I love how you're just staying up straight, exactly what you should be doing. As I point out very often, remember that in the German books about stretching, they talk about leaning over. Well, you can do that, but they always depict someone with a very short stirrup. So point being is, if you're riding in a short jumping length stirrup, you can get away with that because you can go in like a 2-point position. But when you have a dressage length stirrup, you must keep your body weight straight above your heels. Otherwise, you're actually unbalancing the horse to the front. So just to clear up that confusion. But this is beautiful, and look how long this horse's neck looks. When it stretches down now, it literally almost looks as long as the rest of the horse's body, which shows you how little of it that he was actually using up in the air like that. Now this is absolutely wonderful through here. Huge improvement in this horse, already showing a lovely top line. And these horses are so prone, to that underside of the neck, because any horse that's built a little straight like this and from very warm blood kind of or cold blooded type stock, they tend to pull themselves along with their shoulders a great deal. And people got away, once again, a lot of those kind of horses weren't meant for springing up into the air. They were meant for pulling plows and kind of general purpose things. Uh, but that doesn't mean they can't get over their backs and move much better. Even when a horse is in a pulling something, it should still want to push more with its hindquarters than pull with its shoulders. So the same thing true of driving horses as well. But this is absolutely beautiful here, and just such an improvement over when I saw this horse at the clinic. You've come a really long way and shown me that you have a really good feel for this. Really nice right there. Really beautiful trot right there. So when you see the improvement of a horse like this almost looks like a different horse. And once again, look at the hocks. They're now bending and the horse is coming underneath the middle of the body. It's undeniable. This approach that you see people doing of pulling, telling people, oh, we're pulling them back onto the hindquarters. You can't pull a horse onto the hindquarters. All you can do is hollow the back and shorten the step, which gives people a false impression of balance. But as soon as you were to open those horses up, once again, that's the problem with that old style of dressage before dressage evolved into the modern system, when that's all dressage people did. The king rode around in his little tiny arena and and his hollow-backed horses, and people went, oh, how wonderful that is. But of course, as horses got used more for real sport, if you're trained them that way, they can't jump. That is, if they're hollow. No matter how much they can do a sort of fancy phony piaffe or passage, which in most cases that's what we see. But if you took those horses out cross country, they would fall on their heads, because as soon as you open them up, they're completely out of balance, because, as I said, they're just shortened. They're not in working gaits, they're just in shortened gaits. And once we get a horse working over his back, then it really feels solid underneath us. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I will say that, I've never seen a good rider who rides in this fashion ever get seriously hurt. So that's something to think about. Think about, last month alone, there were 4 people killed, 2 in jumping, in eventing, and 2 in jumping by rotational falls. And we must get the information out there of why this is happening. People are talking about safety equipment, but they're not talking about what's actually causing the problem, which is the bad training and holding against the mouth of the horse. But you can only imagine, like, if you were trying to train a horse like this, there's no way this horse would do anything at all for you, as you saw before. If you pull on its mouth, all it's going to do is shorten its step. You're never going to have a big swinging stride the way you see this. So once again, the horse is working over its back at the point when that high thrust of the hind legs, even there, pushes up into the back. So if the back isn't round, if it can't accept that push, which sends the horse forward, then the hips just come higher, which is what you see. So from whatever point the horse's back goes hollow, it'll just go, that part will go up, like the hips will come higher. It's what we see so many dressage horses today who have these weird hollow backs and big hind ends, but with a big dip in front of the saddle, or behind the saddle rather, even in front of as well in the neck, when the neck isn't pulled up. But you're doing a great job here as it comes up. You just follow with your hands, just like that, and then put them right back onto the stretch. So you did just the right thing of just taking just enough contact that the horse didn't want it, so it started seeking a better place. And of course, the beauty of the classical system here is that once we show them that place, that's where they want to go. Many of you have noticed now how when your horses are turned out, they move just like this. They go out and they get over their backs and they move around like that. Because that is actually how nature intended them. They would never been able to get away from the whatever was after them, if they're hollow in the back. They couldn't get away. So that athleticism has a big thing to do with it. That is surviving. So it's a natural position for them to be in. I mean, you take the kind of frames that we see people in dressage shows going. A horse would never put themselves in that kind of, they would, bend their neck over forward and press their chin against their chest is not something that, horses would do in nature very often, or that I've ever seen. I grew up on a farm with a lot of horses. Never seen one do that all by themselves and break their necks over the way we see people doing to horses in draw reins. And on the other hand, neither do they just, it's not classical just because you're riding around with no contact either, which some people think. It's only good if the horse is working over its back, and that's what differentiates dressage from any other form of riding. The problem is there are people that are trying to do this in a hurry, like with roll cur, Unfortunately, they get the horse over the back, but in tension, so the horse never really develops correctly because the muscle is so tight that there's no blood flow through it, nor does the horse come up through the back. So this has been really, really good, and I really look forward to seeing. It's just so great to see people transforming these kinds of horses and realizing what you can do. So imagine, look how beautiful you've made this one. Imagine if you have one of these expensive warm bloods, how beautiful it could be if you start looking at the whole body of the horse of what it's doing instead of just the fancy leg steps. But this is absolutely wonderful work and just exactly where I'd like this horse to be for the amount of time you've had to do this in. So great job. And even able to do a little sitting trot with the horse there. That's absolutely wonderful, as long as the horse can stay in that frame. That's getting a little bit slow right there. You want to see how the horse is just right there starting to get a little labored, but you did just the right thing when it got too slow and you came back to the rising trot. So that was really, really good and shows a huge improvement over this horse and really shows a good sensitivity on your part to what the horse is doing. Now going over a few poles here. Not bad at all. Now notice how the horse stayed in the stretch, and that's exactly what we want it to do. I'm not sure those poles are exactly set right, but let's see if it goes through there again. I don't know what your distance is in there. Yeah, not bad at all, actually. Quite good. Notice how the horse just straight in that stretch. Now what we're looking for is for then beyond that, for there to be no change. Just a little bit of lift is pretty much what you're getting. And this is exactly what you do. This is the beginning of jumping training. A horse going over something while working over its back. So that starts at the trot always. So that's really good work. Now, if the horse were to come up to those poles and throw his head straight up in the air and go over the poles in a kind of phony passage kind of looking trot, then you'd know the horse wasn't really ready to do this, and you'd just go back to, if anything, just one pole at a time. So always start with just one pole. That's where jumping training starts. When you can go over one pole on the ground, over the horse over its back, then you can go over 3 or 5 or however many you want to, as long as the horse stays over its back. Then it's going to be good for it. Once you get that, then you put a fence in the way. So gymnastic jumping, it's a very easy thing to do if you just stick to the program. It just brings the horse right along. Great job, Emmeli. This is Will Faerber from Art to Ride. You've really done a great job here, and I look forward to seeing your next submission.